Hi, this is George Alger, and welcome to another segment of Our Ventura TV. Today's topic is relationships, the good and the bad. And our guest expert today is Ben Kugler, who is the author of The Quest for Compatibility and the Demise of Divorce. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, George. My pleasure to be here.
So, Ben, let's get right into the heart of this.
Okay.
Why are there so many failed relationships?
Well, I think the best way to explain that is to look at some history and perspective of what caused this enormous problem of failed relationships. And if you don't mind, I want to ask you three simple questions. Do you know what the divorce rate was prior to 1900? Do you have any idea?
Lower than now.
That's true. It was actually under 5%.
Really?
And do you know what it went to or rose to in, let's say, 1985?
I know somewhere around there it was 50%.
That's correct. And it has remained there ever since. So we're looking like at a 10x increase that caused that. So the question is, what caused that to occur? Because for years, literally hundreds of years, in this country and other countries, it was well under 5%. So we have this rapid exponential rise, and it's sticking. It's not coming down. And I felt, basically, I've cracked the code on it.
Wow, okay. So what is the cause of failed relationships?
Okay. Back in the good old days, you had 6 key compatibility characteristics. They were race, they were religion, they were a mutual desire to have children. The fourth one had to do with economic stability of the man. The fifth one had to do with some kind of emotional stability of the man. Hopefully he wouldn't beat the woman. And the sixth characteristic was do what dad says, primarily to the daughters. So you basically had a male-dominated world, especially even in the United States. It was male-dominated. And that was the case up and through 1900. If I can just give you some real interesting statistics. Most of the audience has no idea of how manipulated and dominant men were over women. But I think it's important.
I bet some women might think that's true now.
Oh, I'm sure. And most of the people in my workshops, and I've given close to 150, with thousands of people, 80% of them are women. They're very, and I'm definitely a female advocate and child advocate. But prior to 1895, women who were married were not allowed to control their property that they owned. So they could have been willed, bequeathed, etc., property, but if they were married, the husband had the final say. And it wasn't until 1895 that the last state in the Union said that's against the law. Then we had women's suffrage in 1920, where women were finally given the right to vote. That was a big deal, a very big deal. World War II gave women a taste of what it is to be independent, because there were over 3 million men in the armed services, and they were doing everything from Rosie the Riveter to driving trucks and buses, etc. And then you had the 1960s, where the women's movement really advanced, and you had equal rights, equal pay, civil rights. And in 1969, Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of this state, he said that the thing that he most regretted in his entire political career was signing into law the first no-fault divorce that the country ever had. And then subsequent to that, all 49 of the other states fell in line in a very short period of time. For those who've been married back in 1974 or prior to 74, 74 was the first year that women were allowed to have credit cards in their own name instead of their husband's name.
Wow.
Just to show you how this male-dominated world stretched all the way prior from 1900 all the way to 1974. And one last statistic, there are many more, but one that's monumental is 1990. And I'm not sure if it was the state of New Hampshire, I think it was in the Northeast, was the last state of the Union to outlaw where there was rape in other words, of a married woman who was separated going to divorce with her husband. In other words, the police, if a woman called, let's say they were going to the divorce court to sign the papers the next day, they'd been separated for a month, a year, whatever, and he decided that he wanted to have sex with his wife, the police wouldn't come. And that final state was 1990, just to give you an idea of this cultural lag with the women's movement. So basically, you had 6 key compatibility characteristics prior to 1900. And that morphed as the women's movement, which is probably one of the most phenomenal movements in the history of this country, took place. It was fostered and made stronger by the fact that the United States had one of the greatest economic booms in its history during that same period of time, from 1900 going forward to today. And women were able to go out, get a job, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, I forgot Roe versus Wade, 1973. The women had a right to their own body, to say whether they will have a child or not. Regardless of what anyone thinks, this empowered women. It gave them the power that they never had before. And with that, the similarity of likes and dislikes of what brought men and women together changed from 6 to 16 to 60 to 160 to 260 plus key compatibility characteristics. Major revolutionary change. And also prior to that, a love-based relationship wasn't even, I don't even think that it was in the top 30 key compatibility characteristics. Whether you were royalty or middle class or even lower class, if you had a small farm or a large farm, and your father, for future of the family, etc., wanted you to marry the man whose farm was adjacent to yours, and let's say he was 25 or 30 years older than you were as the daughter, you listened to what your father said. And love really had nothing to do with it. But as the women's movement marched on and all of these freedoms occurred, everything changed. The ball game completely changed, and it was dramatic as far as the exponential rise. Now that does not mean, and I'm not inferring, that the women's movement was bad or that the affluence that occurred in the United States was bad. That was great. But there's this cultural lag, and I broke the code as far as what do we have to do for people who have new relationships or not even in a relationship or a long-term relationship. What do they have to do to help ensure the longevity and happiness of that relationship?
So what is this?
Good question.
What is this code?
Okay, well let me in these workshops that I've given, in every single one of them, there is one key question that I ask the audience, which is comprised of about 80% women. I ask, okay, who here has had a failed relationship? 99% of them raise their hand. I think in close to 150 workshops, I've only had 2 people that didn't raise their hands, and I said, excuse me, you never had a failed relationship? And they said, no, I'm going with the guy that I knew from grammar school and or high school. And okay, great, that's fantastic. Yeah. So my next question to this group, after they raise their hands, is to write down, each of the people, men and women, write down 5 reasons that attracted you to that person that you had a failed relationship with. So they write it down, and I'm up at the whiteboard, and I'm asking, okay, give me some input. Well, he had a great smile. He drove a great car. He was a good communicator. He played a mean guitar. It went on and on and on. And by the time I got to 25 or 30 points on the whiteboard, I said, you know, all of these are good, valid reasons, but they weren't enough. They weren't enough to sustain the relationship. And it's true, because you've got compatibility, which is the foundation of everything. The commitment, which is the pledge to do something, the knowledge that you need. For instance, if I might just, Tiger Woods is a great example of a person who was, when he was 5 or 6 years old, he said that he wanted to be the world's greatest golfer. And that was his commitment. On a scale of 1 to 10, he was a 10 on wanting to be the world's greatest golfer. So I'm getting into the cracking of the code. It's called the formula for successful relationships. So you've got compatibility and commitment at the top of, let's say, a triangle. And then you've got demand for knowledge. So on a scale of 1 to 10, if your commitment is a 10, your demand for knowledge will more than likely be insatiable and will also be a 10. And then you'll practice. So compatibility, commitment, demand for knowledge, practice. So in Tiger's case, there are 14 clubs in a golf bag. He made a commitment to be the world's greatest golfer when he was 5 or 6 years old. And he practiced every one of those clubs. He actually learned how to hold, how to swing, how to stand with each one of the clubs, and then he practiced thousands of times, and he became a 10. And in 2012, he actually surpassed Jack Nicklaus and became the all-time money winner of tournaments, PGA tournaments, and money. And he accomplished his dream from the time that he was 5 or 6. Now, the flip side of that, unfortunately, and I think Tiger's a great guy, but he didn't have this formula working for him when he was in his marriage. He had one of the most notorious divorces in history, and it cost literally in excess of $100 million. His commitment, when I asked people in the workshops, what do you think his commitment level was on a 1 to 10? They'd said, well, I said, I think it's a 3. And they said no, because the women said no, it was a -3 is what they felt that it was. Therefore his demand for knowledge was not very high. He's the only one that knows what his commitment to his marriage was. And so let's assume that it was low, unlike his demand to be the world's greatest golfer. So in effect, the demand for knowledge was low, and his practice, whatever that knowledge would have given him, was very low or non-existent, and therefore his success was unsuccessful. He failed. So that really is the bottom line. You have to have compatibility. Even if you're a strong faith-based person, if your compatibility is low, it's going to be a real problem to keep your commitment up and even demand more knowledge to improve it. So what's the answer? The answer is you've really got to do your due diligence. And over 12 years, I created this compatibility test. And there are 285 questions in 13 categories. It's at an electronic website, so it's automated for your audience if they want to go to it. And it's quite amazing. There is nothing like it on the internet. And what it does is it gives the individual their ideal relationship. When they take the test themselves, it tells them exactly in all of these categories. And some of the questions are armor-piercing. They invade a person's privacy. And I apologize in advance if it offends someone, but we want to find out, what is your ideal relationship? Where is it exactly? Because if you know where you want to get to, you can close the gap between the existing scene and the ideal scene by knowing what your ideal scene is. But if you don't know what your ideal scene is, it's a problem. There's a picture in the book Alice in Wonderland. If you can imagine this, the Cheshire Cat is up on a limb and he's got his big grin with his teeth showing, and Alice her back is to the view of the person, and she says to the cat, "Which way should I go from here?" And the cat says, "That depends a great deal on where you want to get to." And Alice says, "I don't know where I want to get to." And the cat finally says, "Well, then it doesn't matter which way you go, as you'll surely get somewhere." And that is the underlying theme of that book that you mentioned and this test. If you don't really know where you're going, you're going to get somewhere. And unfortunately, 50% of the people are going to wind up having a failed relationship if they don't do the due diligence. And as I said, there's nothing. It took 12 years to do this through the help of my audiences that I've had, but I think that we really have something.
Well done.
Thank you.
Ben, we are out of time. Could you just give us the website that
Sure.
people could go to for more information?
Absolutely. Thank you. It's OptimumCompatibility.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.
This is George Alger signing off for this segment of Our Ventura TV. Until we meet again.